The Study of Living Languages Part 2 by Sir Arthur Cotton. Read for the LibriVox Language Learning Collection, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Second, begin with a restricted vocabulary. In the first place, reject, of course, all words which will never be required, such as those used only in learned works. Next, reject all those that hardly ever occur even in books. Next, let alone those that are chiefly in use only in certain particular lines of life, and are more or less technical. Again, have nothing to do with any words that are not commonly used in the ordinary matters of life. What can be gained but clear loss by burthening the young beginner with a multitude of words, by far the greater part of those in the language, that will thus be rejected when they have nothing whatever to do with his acquiring a useful knowledge of the language, and when, if required, they can afterwards be added in a 10th part of the time that they would require at first. Probably, out of 20,000 words in a language, the knowledge of 5,000 would set him so perfectly at liberty in all ordinary conversation that neither he himself nor those he converses with would be reminded that he does not know all. And if occasionally a person used one of the remaining words, probably he could not mistake the meaning of it in the midst of so many known ones, and if he could not perceive what it must mean, he could have no difficulty in asking the meaning or understanding the explanation. Having thus relieved our student from such a mass of useless labour, let us next divide these 5,000 words, or whatever the number is, into several portions, taking out first 1,000, and then another of the least common and least immediately necessary words, till we have only 1,000 left. Out of these again take 250 3 times, and then 150 in the same way, so that to begin we have only 100 of the commonest words in the language, but consisting of all the different parts of speech, so that little sentences may be formed out of them. The learner then deals with only one of these batches of words at a time, not troubling himself with the others till he knows the first batch as well as he does so many words of his own language. This is one of the great essentials of the system proposed. Words should never be partially learnt and forgotten again, nor imperfectly, that is, so that their true value and use are not thoroughly known. When once a word is taken up, it should of course be thoroughly secured, both as respects the meaning of it and its use, and it must be particularly observed that it is not the bare knowledge of a word that is wanted, so that a person, by more or less thought, can recall it to his mind. It must, to be of any use in conversation, be perfectly familiar, and it must have been repeated aloud so many times that the organs of speech have been thoroughly exercised in it, and that it may be pronounced both correctly and with the utmost freedom. Nothing but multiplied repetitions of it aloud, with continued reference to a correct standard and in connection with various other words, can accomplish this. It must take some time thus to appropriate new words, and especially the first 100 words of a language. But the process cannot possibly be hastened, but on the contrary indefinitely delayed, by attempting thousands of others before the first are secured. The number 100 is chosen for the first batch as being about the smallest number that can enable one to take up some variety of short sentences, so that each word may be seen in a variety of situations and in its various inflections, and they are sufficient to provide for exercising the student in the first rudiments of grammar. Third, to each of these batches of words a set of sentences is to be added. These are all to be the commonest colloquial expressions. They should consist of a certain number written on each word in the batch, and contain no words that are not in it. It is essential that they should be written by natives, and those who cannot speak English would be preferable, in order that there may be a security for the sentences being true native expressions. It is also essential that the writers should not be highly educated men, but ordinary intelligent men of the middle classes, otherwise the sentences would be almost sure to be full of fanciful things. The list of words should be given to several different persons in order to secure a good variety of expressions, and some selection should be made. The first set ought not to consist of less than 1,000 sentences, that is, 10 to each word, in order that by means of this batch of words the first rudiments of grammar may be quite familiar, and some considerable notion obtained of the general style of expression peculiar to the language, keeping throughout the grand object in view, which is to arrange that, so far as possible, the attention may be concentrated on one thing at a time. When 100 words have been acquired, all the use possible should be made of them as the vehicle for conveying instructions in other respects before the attention is encumbered by new words, in order that when new words are taken in hand, the student may have his attention in a great measure released from the pressure of the elementary points of grammar, peculiar style of expression, etc. It is also most essential that these sentences should consist of only 2 or 3 words, never more than the latter. It is astonishing how very little new matter overloads the attention of a beginner, and the utmost care is necessary that no more should ever be placed before him at a time than that he can receive a distinct impression of it. A sentence of 4 or 5 words is quite too much at first, and nothing is gained by attempting more than the student is equal to. Comparatively speaking, a very considerable time to the first set of sentences, for there is a great deal to be learnt by them. It is evident that they involve almost all the pronunciation, the inflections of the nouns and verbs, the mode of combining the different parts of speech, the exercise of the organs of speech, and that of the ear on the sound of the language, etc. The first progress of a student in a new language, at least in one entirely dissimilar to his native tongue, is indeed astonishingly slow, and it is of no use attempting to push him on faster than he can go. We constantly meet with what are called easy books for beginners, but probably there is not one published in any language that is 1/100th part easy enough, or that does not seem to suppose a progress at first 100 times more rapid than any student makes. The sentences must of course be translated into English, but it is essential that they should not be written originally in English and then translated into the foreign language. We do not want to teach a man to speak English sentences in foreign words, but to use the foreign expressions. The second set of words, consisting of 150, may perhaps contain 10 sentences for each word, or 1,500 in all. These may be a little longer than the first, as the student will be able to obtain a clear impression of a greater number of words together, but probably they should not exceed 5. After this, the sets of sentences may consist of fewer upon each word, and perhaps only one upon each of the last two batches, and they may be lengthened gradually, the last being of any length. The essential points of these sentences are, therefore, first, that they should be bona fide expressions commonly used in the language, and consequently that they should be originally written in the language by a native. Second, that they should be simple, ordinary, colloquial expressions, and therefore that they should not be written by learned men who would probably spoil them. Third, that they should be extremely short, the first set not exceeding 3 words, and the others very gradually lengthened. Fourth, that there should be a large number of them in the first set of words, so as to make as much use as possible of those words before proceeding to new ones. Fifth, that there should be as great a variety of expressions in the sentences as possible. In printing the sentences there should be, first, the native words separately and in the proper character. Second, under each of them, the same word in the English character. Third, the most exact English meaning of each individual word. And fourth, the full power of the sentence freely given in English. The use of the native character is to enable a native to teach from the book, who does not know English. As one great point in preparing these materials is to provide for a person having to learn the language with the help of natives who do not understand English or who are not thoroughly qualified teachers, it is desirable, if possible, that these sentences should have numerous notes subjoined, giving all the information that can be suggested by each sentence, and that can, in any way, help to give the student an intelligent knowledge of the language. These notes should, if possible, be written by an intelligent Englishman, who will know from his own experience what misapprehensions beginners are liable to form on account of their English ideas, and what points are likely to be difficulties to them. If the first 2 sets of words had 10 sentences in each, and the last 1,000 words 4 on each, the whole of the sentences on, suppose, 2,000 words would amount to about 10,000, which would be sufficient to make the student thoroughly at home in expressing himself freely on all common subjects. Besides these general words and sentences, each student, according to his profession, ought to have a separate set of words and expressions belonging to his peculiar occupations, whether those of a magistrate, a merchant, a missionary, an engineer, etc. But it would be of no use his acquiring this information till he was in some good measure grounded in the more general use of the language, and therefore he should not perhaps take such a list of words in hand till he had gone through the first 2,000 general words with their sentences. The professional sentences should contain, of course, only those words already learnt in addition to the technical words. With these sets of words and sentences, there should be a short grammar containing only the first rudiments, in the simplest possible form, so that it can be referred to without loss of time on any point. This, however, in fact, should be made comparatively very little use of. Rules of grammar are not wanted. A man in conversation cannot possibly stop to form the participle of a verb from the root by considering the rules. If it does not come of itself into his mouth, nothing can make amends for that defect. What is wanted is such a knowledge of grammar as a child of 4 years old possesses, that is, a knowledge which enables him to speak correctly, intelligibly, and without hesitation, though he does not know a single rule for anything he says. His speaking must be independent of any rules, whether he has learnt any or not. Yet a short grammar, to be looked into occasionally, at first may be of some little assistance in acquiring the inflections of the nouns and verbs, etc., but the grand means of acquiring a grammatical use of the language must be simply the repetition multiplied of a good variety of correct forms of expression. Nothing can be more absurd than insisting upon knowing the rules of grammar before a student can be allowed to know a language. If a man talks English grammatically, that is, correctly, he is never examined as to whether he knows any rules. Perhaps he never learnt a line of any English grammar, but it makes no difference. But it is always expected that a man studying a foreign language should be able to stand an examination of a kind neither he nor his examiner could stand in his mother tongue. The same man who meets a stranger in the street and knows well by the first sentence that he utters whether he is perfectly acquainted with English or not, is perhaps on his way to some place where he will pass hours in ascertaining whether a student has a good knowledge of a language foreign to him. These are, therefore, the materials which I would put into any man's hands who wants to study a foreign language for colloquial purposes, namely, a vocabulary of perhaps 2,000 words divided into sets of from 100 to 250, with about 10,000 common forms of expression composed only of each set of words and those words previously learnt. These printed both in the native and English character, with a verbal and a free translation, the sentences to be aided, if possible, by copious notes giving all the collateral information possible, and to these to be added a very short rudimental grammar. It will not perhaps be necessary to give the verbal translations of any but the first 2,000 or 3,000 sentences. As to the student's further study, he may of course now with perfect ease follow the ordinary plan, that is, take up any book that contains the sort of words and matter most suited to his line of life, with an ordinary dictionary and grammar, to which, however, he will have very seldom to refer. He will know so large a portion of the words that the context will generally show the meaning of any new word he meets with, and he will lose very little of his time in that which usually occupies about 3/4 of all the time expended in such studies, namely in turning over the leaves of a large dictionary and guessing which of the several meanings there found for a word is compatible with those of the other words of the sentence before him, many of which he has also yet to ascertain. But his great business should of course be to converse as constantly as possible in order further to exercise his tongue and his ear, and to add to his stock of forms of expression. It is to be remembered that, in using books, a principal exercise should be reading aloud and having them read aloud to him by a native. If his occupation will require formal writing or translating, of course he must exercise himself a good deal with books. It is well known that the most easy and certain way of acquiring a correct and easy style in writing in any foreign language is to make or procure accurate translations of native books, and then retranslate them, comparing such retranslation with the original, and thoroughly considering the difference between them. This can be done with the greatest ease and economy of time, when such a good fundamental knowledge has been acquired as is supposed to be obtained through the system now proposed. The next point to be considered is the mode of using these materials. The student begins with the English letters representing the sounds. The teacher sounds each letter and the student repeats it immediately after. This is done many times with those letters which represent sounds entirely strange to the learner. The most essential thing is to learn where to place the tongue in these last sounds, without doing which it is impossible he should utter them correctly. And this must be most patiently and diligently practiced, because this new motion of the tongue must be acquired to the same degree of facility as he has in pronouncing the sounds of his own language. This cannot possibly be effected except by long continued use of the organs of speech. At first, each of these letters should be pronounced perhaps 10 times over by the teacher, and repeated by the student instantly, the latter always observing correctly the difference between his own pronunciation and that of the teacher's, which immediately follows. The grand means to attain a correct pronunciation must always be thus for the learner to attempt to both immediately after and immediately before hearing it correctly pronounced by a native. Just as in learning to write, it is not sufficient first to look at the original and then try to imitate it, but after writing it, to look again at the original to see in what respect the copy has failed. Of course, it will only be necessary to do this with the new sounds, which will generally be only very few. The student next takes the first list of 100 words, which are all written in the shortest form, that is, the radical form of the verb, etc., as we should write in English: good, go, little, come, etc. The teacher should then pronounce the first word deliberately, and the student should repeat it, followed by the English meaning of it, when it should again be repeated by the teacher, and this suppose 5 times at first. In this way, the whole 100 words would be gone over many hundred times before the student ventures to attempt pronouncing them by himself. The teacher and student should sit at some distance apart, so that it may be necessary to speak pretty loud. In these first exercises, the student should have the printed words before him, that he may have the assistance of sight in addition to that of hearing in impressing them on his memory. It will of course be at first tiresome to continue this exercise long, nevertheless the longer the better, and if a person could arrange to do it for 1 or 2 hours at 3 or 4 different times in the day, it would probably be best. But he should not attempt to learn them by heart, because his pronunciation will not be sufficiently confirmed. When he has become tolerably familiar with the words of the first set of sentences, both as to pronunciation and meaning, by thus repeating them with his teacher several times and with his book before him, he should put down his book and go over them again in the same way several times, without seeing the words, so as to be wholly dependent upon the ear. From the first, the ear must be exercised as far as possible without any aid from the eye. It must be kept continually in mind that the sight is to be used as little as possible for the reasons before given. The sentence should not be read together the first time of going over, because the student is not yet able to receive any distinct impression from more than one word at a time. The student should not yet trouble himself about the mode of framing the inflections that he meets with, but be content to take the word with its exact English meaning as he finds it. In this way he should go through the first 1,000 sentences with his teacher, which will perhaps take him 15 hours, or suppose 3 days' study, during which time he would have repeated every word of the first 100 words on an average about 150 times, including the separate readings of the list of words. Less than 3 times repetition of each word is not sufficient to ensure the student's correcting himself when he pronounces it imperfectly the first time. After the first and second reading of the sentences, repeating each word by word, the whole sentence should be repeated in the same way at least 3 times over, the student repeating the free English translation after the foreign sentence. The readings should be repeated till every word has been heard and uttered, suppose 600 times. During these readings, the grammar of the nouns and verbs may be looked into a little, and, lastly, the sentence should be learnt by heart, and when the student is well exercised in the pronunciation by these means, so that he can trust himself to utter it without first hearing it spoken, the sentence should be again gone over in the same way, but the teacher beginning by repeating first the English word when the student gives the foreign one, the teacher immediately repeating it again, and so on. But if it is found that the student cannot yet remember the word and pronounce it with perfect ease, they should be read over again in the former way. When able to do it, the whole set of sentences should be again gone through without the words being repeated individually, the teacher the first time giving the foreign sentence and the next time giving first the English sentence. It may be supposed that all this will not be necessary, and it certainly is not, in order to obtain such a knowledge as is usually supposed to be sufficient, that is, a knowledge which, when brought to the trial of conversation, is found to be of little or no use. But it will be found that, to obtain a really familiar acquaintance with the first set of words and their easy and correct pronunciation and use, these multiplied repetitions are absolutely necessary. Nothing but a long continued exercise of the ear and the organs of speech upon a great variety of actual expressions can give either that quickness at hearing and pronouncing, or that facility of correctly combining the words which are essential to their effective colloquial use. It must be particularly observed that this first set of sentences thus acquired implies much more than might appear from the first glance, namely, there is involved in it, as it were, the whole pronunciation of the language, for a man who can pronounce freely and correctly 100 words will have little difficulty in pronouncing all the rest. Second, a knowledge of all the inflections of the nouns and verbs. Third, the mode of combining and arranging the different parts of speech. Thus, though only 100 words are used, some real and considerable progress has already been made in the knowledge of the language. This first set of sentences should not be laid aside till they are so perfectly familiar that almost any one of them can be repeated with the utmost readiness, on the English translation being uttered. Nothing whatever will be gained by meddling with new materials till these first are thoroughly wrought into the student, and made as much part of himself as the words and expressions of his own language. The second set of words and sentences must be read over and thoroughly appropriated in the same way as the first. Probably these first 250 words with their sentences may be mastered in a month of steady study of 3 or 4 hours a day, and 750 additional words with about 3,000 longer sentences in another month, completing the first 1,000 words in 2 months. After the thorough grounding which this will give in every respect, in pronunciation, in expression, in hearing, in grammar, etc., the additions will be made with much greater rapidity. Everything depends upon this first grounding being thorough and complete. Nothing but such repetitions will accomplish this object. There is no other way of doing it. A soldier may be shown how to march, and he may be made to move his legs in the manner shown in a few steps, but nothing but long continued practice can possibly enable him to do it both correctly and with ease, and it is the same with the muscles of the tongue, the ear, and the brain as it is with the limbs. A girl may have the finest ear possible, but that will not enable her fingers to run over the notes of a piano, or her throat to produce the notes of a song without long exercise of those organs. After the first month, the teacher will be required much less, because the student can be trusted to pronounce, provided he exercises with the teacher for some time daily. He should also read aloud by himself, just as when he reads with the teacher, both because the great point is the exercise of the organs of speech and hearing, and also because the pronouncing of the word is so great a help to remember the meaning. It must, however, be remembered that in this solitary study as little use as possible should be made of the eye. The word or sentence should be merely glanced at when necessary, and the repetition should then be made without looking at the book. With respect to the time required, I cannot speak certainly, because I have never had an opportunity of seeing the study commenced with such materials properly prepared beforehand, but so far as I have seen it tried with imperfect materials, the result was certainly excellent. In the only case where an approach was made to a fair trial, a gentleman studied irregularly, but equal to about 2 months of continuous study of 5 hours a day, and from that time he went out and performed all his duties without an interpreter, having constantly to converse with the middling and lower classes, most of whom had never spoken to a European before. This was a real practical and effective acquaintance with the language, though within small limits as to his number of words and expressions at first starting. But then his ear and tongue having been well exercised, he could both make himself understood, and he could recognize the words spoken to him, and consequently he was in a position to make steady progress in the correct use of the language from his intercourse with the people, and this he accordingly did. It would of course have been much better if he could have continued the same course of study, though it were only for an hour or two a day, by which he would have far more rapidly added to his stock of words and expressions. An educated native who had, I believe, helped to teach this gentleman, lately told me that he had overheard natives speaking of him, who said that if they had not seen him, they should not have known that it was not a native who was speaking Telugu. It is very probable that many persons will complete the appropriation of the first 1,000 words and their sentences in 1 month. I would now only ask, which is preferable as a foundation, such a really effective use of a language, though within small limits, or such a loose, vague, and useless knowledge of a vast number of words with the rules of grammar as is usually acquired after at least many months of hard study, during the whole of which time, too, the attention has been kept in a very injurious state of tension by the overwhelming load of new things that has continually been laid upon it at one and the same time. I believe that in general little effective colloquial use of such a language is acquired within a year of hard study, and that often 2 or 3 years or more pass before the student can talk it tolerably, and that often 2 or 3 years or more pass before the student can talk it tolerably, though only a portion of that time, of course, is actually employed in study. On one occasion I was acquainted with 2 men who studied intensely about 10 hours a day for 9 months, after which, upon trial, they found that they could scarcely hold the slightest communication with natives. A remarkably apposite passage from the life of Dr. Hope may here be quoted, which I have just met with, and in which a part of the very means here proposed is stated to have been used by him with the most remarkable success, though he did not begin upon this plan, but merely learnt the colloquial use of a language after he had acquired a considerable stock of words. He had already picked up a good knowledge of French and Italian, so far as mere reading went, and he imagined, like many others, that a little practice on the road would enable him to speak the language sufficiently to carry him through his tour. But it was a very different thing to hear the lessons of professors and to converse with the natives of the country. Of this he found a very humiliating proof. He went to engage apartments at a private hotel, but after a pantomimic performance of 20 minutes between himself and the landlady, it was found that neither could in the slightest degree understand the other, and after laughter and reciprocal bows he returned in despair. Having settled at another hotel, he now determined to devote 12 hours a day to the mere practice of speaking French. His first step was to engage a French master for 12 lessons, and to make him go through the drudgery of reading 3 words at a time, while he mimicked them as closely as he could. This was singularly disagreeable to the master, but it was all that Dr. Hope wanted, and he was inflexible. He thus secured himself against any gross error in pronunciation. He happened to possess a Vannostrocht's grammar with a key to it, a grammar which is remarkable for the great number of simple exercises which illustrate each rule. He now translated these exercises from English to French, correcting himself by constant reference to the key. In this way he went 2 or 3 times through the grammar in the course of a month, gaining flexibility of tongue and losing the fear of hearing his own voice. He at the same time adopted another device. He went to dine daily at a small and crowded restaurant, frequented by the garde du corps, where the company was so closely packed that he could not help hearing the conversation of 2 or 3 contiguous talkers. In this way his ear got familiarized with all the sounds of the French language, whether quick or slow, correct or provincial. At the end of a month he ventured to sally forth, and having a fancy for the rooms of the private hotel to which he had originally gone, he waited on the landlady. On entering, he addressed her in fluent French, explained his wishes, etc. The landlady, the meanwhile, with upraised hands and a look of utter amazement, exclaiming, "Voilà un miracle!" You cannot be the same gentleman that came here a month ago and could not speak a word of French. This case has no reference to the principles here proposed, so far as the use of a restricted vocabulary is concerned, but it shows how perfectly ineffectual the knowledge of book language and the exercise of the eye was for colloquial purposes, and how complete the success was, both in respect of time and effect, when the means here proposed were used, namely, thorough appropriation of a good stock of simple familiar sentences, and the diligent exercise of the ear and tongue. He was totally without the colloquial use of the language, so that he could neither understand a word spoken nor speak one intelligibly when he began to adopt the means he did, and in 1 month he found himself perfectly at liberty in conversation. In the same memoir it is afterwards related, having had a lesson in France on the occasion of not being able to speak the language of a country in which one is travelling and studying, Dr. Hope guarded against a similar inconvenience in Italy. Before leaving Paris, he improved his pronunciation of Italian by taking 12 lessons, as he had formerly done in French, and he provided himself with a brief practical Italian grammar, with exercises referring to the rules and a key to them. During a tour in Switzerland, it was agreed that he should walk in advance of his friend for an hour daily, to give him an opportunity of practicing these exercises viva voce. This plan answered perfectly. At the end of the time, he spoke Italian fluently. It may perhaps help to show, yet more distinctly, how far the principles here advocated differ from, or agree with, some of the commonly received notions on the subject, if I place my views side by side with those lately advanced in an elementary book for helping the student of an Indian language. The first principle laid down is, don't proceed too quickly. An entirely new language requires great accuracy in the mastering of its elements. In this I agree, but I consider the book itself implies a progress in the learner immeasurably beyond the reality. Second, write down everything from the beginning. Read always with pen or pencil in hand. This is directly opposed to 2 of my principles, one an essential one, the other one of great importance. The first, that everything is to be learnt through the ear, and not through the eye, because it is the ear that is to be employed in using the language, and not the eye. The other, that the foreign character should not be used by the beginner, because time must be saved in learning one thing at a time, and the character is not necessary to enable one to learn the language itself. Third, read aloud all the exercises with a Tamil teacher, and be very careful in ascertaining the correctness of what you have written. Here it is evident that there was some sort of loose notion about the exercise of the tongue, but it also shows that there was nothing like a real apprehension of the essential importance of this, nor to the extent to which that exercise should be carried, nor is anything at all said about that which I insist upon as the main point, namely the impossibility of learning to pronounce correctly, and the certainty of being established in a false pronunciation unless, for some considerable time, no word is pronounced without referring at the time to a correct standard, without the student hearing one word at a time pronounced both immediately before and immediately after himself by a native. As to the latter clause of this hint, I urge that the only possible way to secure the correctness of what one learns is not to attempt to invent anything, but to be content to learn everything, every sound, every word, every expression from a native. Fourth, at first, whenever you meet with a new word, look for it in the vocabulary and decline and conjugate it in full. My rule is, never meet with a new word, and never lose a minute in looking for a word in a vocabulary, or in guessing which of the different meanings that may be there given is the right one, and never lose time in declining and conjugating a word in full. Use only limited lists of words, and thoroughly appropriate every one by hearing it applied in a great variety of short sentences, in the course of which exercises the grammar will necessarily be picked up long before the pronunciation and value and use of the word are fully acquired. Yet it will be of some use to look occasionally into a short grammar containing the inflections of words. Fifth, begin to talk, though with stammering lips, as soon as possible, the very first day. Never speak English to a native if you can help it. Why say salt when you know the word uppu? Do not be afraid of making mistakes. This rule contains the very essence of the ordinary system, or rather of the old notions. It is diametrically opposed to the universally acknowledged and universally applicable principle. Whatever is habitual is easy. It is always easier to do a thing the second time than the first. My principle is, be afraid of one thing, making mistakes. Every time that a mistake is made, one step more is taken towards a confirmed habit of making that mistake. Why do men in talking English as their own language go on putting H's in the wrong places and leaving them out all their lives, in spite of their getting into a different class of society, where they continually hear the correct pronunciation in this respect, without ever being corrected? Because, by habit, their perceptions have been so blunted that they never perceive that they make a mistake. Do we not keep this principle of avoiding mistakes in view in almost all other cases excepting this? Do we set a child to make a rude imitation of some letter and then leave him to repeat it without a standard? Or do we insist upon his incessantly looking at a standard and never making one written letter without trying to imitate that standard which is placed before his eyes? My principle, therefore, is, never attempt to guess at anything, whether it is a sound or word or an expression. Take the most effective steps you can to prevent you ever making a mistake. Is there not enough work to do to learn the real language that you must take measures to oblige yourself to add to it the unlearning of your own mistakes? Every time you pronounce a word wrong, you have that to unlearn. On no account, therefore, attempt to speak in the proper sense of that word till you are established in, first, a sound pronunciation; second, in the knowledge of the true value of a stock of words; third, in that of a good amount of grammar; fourth, in that of a large stock of bona fide native expressions. Is not this principle undeniable? Does a drawing master tell his pupil, go and make rude and absurd drawings of a hand or a foot, and then occupy yourself in unlearning the habit you have been acquiring? Or does he set before his pupil a true representative of a thing, and say, imitate this? with the most earnest and close attention, and never make a line without referring to the standard. Which pupil would make the greatest progress, and which would be most likely to attain to perfection in his study? One who was always trying to make rude drawings of a foot out of his own imagination and then labouring to correct them, or one who did not attempt to invent at all, but kept exercising himself in imitating a correct representation of a foot? Sixth, be very careful in noting down differences in idiom between your own language and Tamil. If you hear much Christian or Kutchery Tamil, beware of thinking all you hear to be really Tamil. Try to cultivate a Tamil ear, so as to detect an unidiomatic expression as you would a false note in music. You should understand all you hear. You need not use any expression that is not good Tamil. I would only ask how a student can possibly learn to distinguish between true language and false, except by learning the true and taking care as far as possible not to come in contact with false language, whether coming from himself or anybody else, till he has acquired a sound taste and judgment by a confirmed knowledge of the true language. The simple rule is, learn the true language, and then you will not waste your time in acquiring and trying to unlearn a false one. Sow clean wheat in your ground, and not wheat and weeds mixed together, and then you will not require to employ all the season in trying in vain to root out the weeds which you have yourself sown. It is this sort of instructions continually inserted in books of instruction in languages, and which are directly opposed to well-known general principles, which show so plainly how entirely undigested the subject still is, and how people in general are still acting upon notions that they have never examined, and which will not bear the least examination. In the book which is prefaced by these rules, the materials provided to assist the learner of Tamil are all prepared upon the usual false principles. First, an unlimited vocabulary is used, so that every word must be learnt and forgotten 100 times over. Second, all sorts of words are introduced, words perfectly useless to a beginner, words derived from Sanskrit and scarcely ever used in conversation, words used only in books translated from English by Englishmen, etc. Third, the sentences are certainly not all written by a native, so that the learner takes up the book with the encouraging feeling that he does not know which are true Tamil sentences and which are not. Fourth, almost all the sentences are much too long for a beginner. Fifth, many of the sentences are such as it is quite useless for a beginner to learn. Sixth, English sentences are given without the corresponding Tamil. How is the learner to discover what the proper Tamil would be unless he is told? Seventh, the same with the Tamil sentences. What can be the use of leaving the learner to guess what the English meaning is, knowing that when he has guessed it, it may be either right or wrong? Suppose a Tamil man were learning English. How could he find out the expression we use when we ask who a certain person is? How could he ever guess the expression, "Who's that?" Or could he find out of himself these expressions: "What's the matter? Where has he been? Come away. I'd rather not. Never mind. Whether or no, I can't help it." You might as well set a man to guess at the words of a language as at its common expressions. When I put this book into a munshi's hand, The first thing he said was, "Many of these expressions are not common Tamil expressions, and many of the words are not commonly used in conversation." This might be said of almost any book, I suppose every book of the kind. What is a learner to do who has no better materials? It is destructive for a learner to use a book when he is not sure whether the sentences are Tamil or not. I mention these particulars of this book as illustrative of the mistakes and undigested ideas that are current on the subject. End of the study of living languages, Part 2. End of the study of living languages by Sir Arthur Cotton. Recording by Nicholas James Bridgewater. Recorded in London, England.